Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 298. A technical manager or leader should only be concerned about developing talented engineers, right? Tad Reeves would tell you the technical manager should also be developing future leaders. But how do you do that exactly? If you want to get down to the answer, you've come to the right place as we get to part 3 of our discussion with Tad Reeves, a principal architect at Arbery Digital. If you missed our previous discussions with Tad, let's give you a quick recap to get you up to speed. In part 1 of our discussion with Tad in episode 296, we heard about his early career and how Tad fell in love with technology after his original focus on mechanical engineering and graphic design. There was this theme of learning, going deep into the material and the foundational concepts to build an expertise that brought him a lot of opportunities over time. In part 2 of the discussion with Tad in episode 297, Tad shared some of his experience doing consulting work and doing contract work. We talked about how the time of your life could make consulting work a challenge and how Tad continued to integrate design into his normal work. And we also heard about how he got into Adobe Experience Manager. This week in part 3 of the discussion with Tad, you'll hear about how he got into blogging. Not only can blogging be a way to build expertise, but what if we thought more about the intention for doing it in the first place? You'll also hear how Tad got into people leadership, some philosophies on doing the job well, and how to decide if you want to keep doing it. Let's get you straight to the action as we share part 3 of our discussion with Tad Reeves. One of the places we can put evidence of solving those cool problems and all the metrics that go with it is on LinkedIn. How have you used that to your advantage over time, Tad?
I see people every so often, they're like, I don't even know why I'm on LinkedIn. And I'm like, well, you know what? I know why I'm on LinkedIn. Because ever since AARP, every single job, and I've had a bunch of contracts and stuff like that since then, every single job I have, I've been passive recruited off of LinkedIn. Every last one. And most of the time, I don't even update my resume. My resume is LinkedIn, and that's where all the work comes from. So there's a reason to be on LinkedIn. There's also a reason to be civil and always present the face that you want other people to see on LinkedIn, because you never know. Almost certainly, somebody who's going to hire you is going to be seeing you. So if you have a proclivity for political rantings or something like that, you should probably take that somewhere else. There are other better places that aren't going to affect your career.
For sure. Well, speaking of LinkedIn and showcasing your work and building a portfolio of things that are public facing, you kind of started to get into the Adobe Experience Manager world, and you took those skills of writing and presenting and started using those a little bit more. What drove that?
I'd been blogging for a while just because it was interesting, but I started writing articles to myself at first. Like whenever I'd figure something out, I'd be like, okay, Google's better than the Confluent search engine anyway. So I'm just going to write it on my own blog and I'll find it later. You know, how do I change the admin password on something, or how do I, whatever, right? I didn't realize this, but I was starting to get a little bit of traffic. And I went to my first Adobe Summit, which is a big conference in Vegas they do every year where they just talk all about marketing technology. And some person comes up to me. He's like, "You're Tad Reeves." I'm like, I am. He's like, "I read your articles on this and this and this, and they're wonderful, and they saved me so much time." And I'm like, "Serious?" He's like, "Yes. Can I take a selfie with you?" I'm like, yes.
That's so cool.
I sat there in shock afterwards. And you know what? 3 people at that conference came up to me wanting selfies. And I'm like, I'd written technical articles about how I do a continuous integration pipeline or something. It was like, these are not like what you would consider interesting, most people. Here's how to do a blue-green deployment or something, or I did a bunch of infrastructure diagrams, mostly because I was trying to show them to other people. I never could find one that I liked, so I just made them myself because I like designing. And these visitors that I see stats are real people that I can really affect. This is fun. That was another one of these little moments of like, this is kind of fun. Not only can I help direct customers, I can help other engineers too. And it also ends up giving me work. Audiences is a really interesting thing to think with when you're thinking of who you're writing for. I see a lot of marketing content out there where an agency will write something and they're writing something all high-minded and you're just trying to talk to some SVP someplace using all this floral language. And I don't know, it doesn't really communicate to me. But then again, I'm not an SVP. But a lot of times what has gotten me work is I just write a bunch of helpful stuff. Would this help somebody else do something? Is it giving away some of my secret sauce? I don't know, maybe. But is it going to help somebody? Probably. At least some of these people end up saying, you seem like you know what you're doing. I don't really want to do all those things that were in your article. Would you mind coming over and doing it? And then you get hired. So it's that sort of a thing that can lead to a lot of work in addition to being fulfilling.
Did you have to get past any sort of initial nervousness of putting it out there where it was publicly accessible? Because I've spoken to people who maybe I've even suggested it, or maybe they've thought about it, but there's something that keeps them from doing it. Like they're nervous about what other people will think, or other people have written about this already, or it won't be very good.
In some cases, I had some little things to get over. I mean, there's one time, so analytics, again, I'm very passionate about. Really love analytics, really love stats. I got really good. I got certified in Splunk.
Mm-hmm.
Splunk is a great tool. I'm sure you've used it. Splunk is amazing. So when I was working at one particular company, they're like, okay, well, we have Splunk, but our CTO went and talked to some guy with a new competing product. It's young, but he gave me a great deal. So we're going to switch to it. And I'm like, please don't. It doesn't do anything that Splunk. Please just don't do that. And the guy said, well, it's going to happen. We're already signing the contract. So I ended up doing a whole big research project on my own. And let me just list out all the things that this thing does versus Splunk. And I just made a whole and I just wrote it in an article. So the sales rep for this other company finds it. I didn't have my name on it, but he looks me up on Twitter and then goes and brings the blog post to the VP of my company, who brings it to my boss, who brings me into an office and says, why are you talking bad about our partner? He's like, yeah, you got to take this down. I'm like, it's my blog. I didn't even mention you. So I realized, okay, fine. In some cases, I need to make sure that I'm diplomatic in my language. Maybe in some cases, I could have been more diplomatic in my language because I can get emphatic sometimes. But aside from that, I know that there are people who are out there who will distort what you say. I've had my fair share of online harassment and bullying for various reasons and so forth. And so I know that those guys are out there. But at the same time, what's true is true, and you can't necessarily change them. All you can do is just keep talking. So you could let them be louder than you, or you can just keep being loud. So I don't know. I just keep talking.
Yeah. You can only control what you do, how you act, what you say.
That's right.
And your intentions. I like that. And how did this emphasis on writing improve your communication skills? Or did you notice a difference?
No, there was a difference. So here's actually how it happened. So I worked for a while at Rackspace. And so this is after I was doing a bunch of different consulting work on Adobe Experience Manager. And then I ended up working in their managed hosting unit. Rackspace was an amazing company at the time I was there. It was very, very cutting edge. Their headquarters was in a mall. It was an old mall in San Antonio. And in the mall was basically 1,000 top-end engineers of various sorts all over the place. There were DNS guys and VMware people and public clouds of every sort and the load balancer guys and the hosting guys and the AEM guys. So no matter what problem you had, you didn't have to ever worry, like, do I have anybody who I can come to with my problem? You just go to the best, like, oh, I know the guy who wrote part of the kernel for that. Okay, good. Let me go ask him. So you had all these giants to stand on. So you could start really kind of building yourself up as like somebody who knew a bunch of stuff. So I continued to write. Next thing you know, though, I got offered a job as like a architect, basically. I'm an engineer, man. I'm not an architect. They're like, you're the most prominent person in this field. I don't know about that. You're like, yeah, you're a thought leader. I'm like, I write blogs, but you're like, oh, everybody we talk to, they keep referencing your work. I'm like, all right, I'm not a title guy. So you're going to have to say the title. I'm just going to keep saying engineer. If that's cool. And until I finally pass my architect exam. And I'm like, okay, fine, I'll call myself an architect. I don't like self-embellishing, but that's just the thing though, is like sometimes then you get put into situations where somebody says, okay, you've seen a bunch of these. And then I look back and I actually, while I was there, I went and made a list. I'm like, good, well, how many AEM installations have I touched at this point? The list got really, really long. And I'm like, wow, actually, it's literally scores of different companies now. I guess I can draw on that. Like, I guess I don't have to have this whole like, oh, I'm just a little guy writing a blog. I've actually touched a lot of stuff. I could make a broad statement and have it not be based on my mind, but based on having seen a bunch of stuff. That was the next major career jump. Was I don't have to be embarrassed about having an opinion.
And what does it mean to you to be an architect as opposed to I'm an engineer?
I was reflecting on that recently. I think some of it is in whatever field that you are calling yourself an architect. And in technology, you've got architects and all kinds of, you have enterprise architects, and then you've got VMware architects, and you've got whatever architects, application architects of various sorts. To me, what this ended up coming down to is not only do you not only know how it works, but have you seen enough implementations done correctly and really horribly wrong to be able to have some valuable opinions on how something should be put together, to where you're not just reading the manual and doing what the company says are best practices, but you have these things that are based on actual experience. And then in that case too, might have valuable insights that you can even contribute back to the company and to the vendor. At that point, I really kind of feel like that's where you start to flip the switch between being an engineer and an architect, of where not only could I sit down and make this thing, follow orders to make it and do it right and solve the problems to do it, but do I know all of the things that this thing can do? Do I know what it's meant for and what it's really not meant for? Do I know the difference between the marketing material and where the rubber meets the road? And I feel like those sort of terms kind of put you more in architect land. That's my own personal opinion. Others might have a different definition of what an architect is. But to me, if I have architects around me, those are qualities that they have, is that they can think on their feet. And there are also people who have probably lived through some mistakes also. Sometimes people like having conversations about like interview questions that they like to ask. Mistake related questions are some of my favorite and most revelatory interview questions. Ask somebody like, all right, tell me the worst outage you've personally had. And then what did you learn about it? And some people are physically unable to tell about a fault, I have found in interviews. Like they just like, yeah, and the developers pushed and then it went down. What was your responsibility there? I being able to own up to something that you like, oh yeah, no, this is the biggest outage of my career. It was awful. It was rough. And I had to talk about it to some very hot people who were very hot about why this was down. But I lived through it. And you know what I learned? And then that's valuable. Like, I want that guy.
When you ask that question to people you might be interviewing, are you looking for outages they caused or outages that they just had a hand in resolving, or both?
I would like to know when somebody has recognized a fault or a way that they should have done it better. I would like to know that. Very seldom has somebody led a perfect technical career. I don't even know that exists. To be able to say, you know what, we didn't have health checks for this, and this. And as a result, this thing was dead and nobody knew. And I didn't know. And so I finally brought it back up. That's it. Health checks for everything. We got a new product and we did this. Now that's valuable. It's responsible. You know, you pointed out what you did. Like, yeah, there's a point where I'm like, nah, I'm too lazy to put these in. Or somebody else should do this. But now I learned my lessons. And now I'm the manager. So yeah, I am interested in that sort of thing. So I don't know. If you're ever in an interview with me, admit the fault.
So speaking of interviews, Tad, you're talking about interviewing people. We hinted earlier that you became a people manager. Let's talk about the decision to take that on, why you wanted to do it, if you enjoyed it or if you didn't enjoy it, and some ideas for people to determine whether being a people leader is right for them?
So being a people person, I think it's its own skill. And being a tech leader, I've reflected on this a good bit. I don't know that there's any one simple set of like, well, I follow these 6 rules and they always get me through. As it's a complicated game and there's not one single set of things that makes that work. When I was doing work for the Church of Scientology, and we had a pretty large website stack. We had a lot of different nonprofit outreach activities, some of which were very large. They sponsor what is the largest non-governmental drug education campaign, actually. At the time that I was there, we had it in 20 languages. It was a massive production. That was one of 15 major properties that we had, major properties, something like 93 other minor properties. There's a lot of properties. I started out doing system administration work, but it was sort of like we were talking about early in the talk, in that sometimes it just comes down to when somebody says, well, we need a plan for how to do such and such. And if there's blank stares all around and I go, I can make that plan if you want. I don't know that it'll be exactly what you want, but I'll make that plan. And then if the plan's good and then you're running that plan, and next thing you know, you're a people person. But in doing that, you kind of quickly start to try to get a sense of what sort of an organization can get stuff done in a technical field, because you're going to have a big mix of people. Some are much more technical than others. You can't treat them all with a broad brush. And especially when you're talking about executing a campaign, a major website redesign or something like that, where you've got content editors, designers, developers, system guys, some e-com stuff. Like you got all that happening all at the same time. And you also can't be the single point for all of them. You can't be like the Mussolini where everything comes to you and you're just somehow being the single boss for everything. I mean, I've seen people with various philosophies on how they want to run things. And some people are like, oh, it's totally flat around here. Everybody has a direct line to me. I don't know about that. You kind of have to figure out the right way to run that in terms of delegating responsibility, not just responsibility to get something done, but delegating leadership responsibility. And that is one of the hardest lessons to learn in management is how do you build up engineers underneath you, but how do you build up leaders underneath you and rely on somebody to get something done.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about that if you don't mind sharing some examples.
We had a whole team doing things in Europe. That was some of my first remote management work, where somebody's in Denmark and he's got a whole team of folks working with them, and they got translators who are working on stuff and some designers, and I got to get them to get something done. There's some cases a language barrier, and you got to pick somebody who's actually going to get it done over there. And you can't be there. You can't fly out there and wrangle it yourself, right? So fostering the ability to have an open line, so you're not, chopping people to pieces with demands where you know that if there's problems that they're not afraid to bring those problems to you. So I definitely know I didn't get it right at first and had to go through waves of like, okay, good. How can I be a better manager, a better leader, just really to the benefit of the project? Because really at the end, you're just trying to get the project done. You're not doing it for your own self-aggrandizement. You're just going, one way or another, this thing's got to get done.
Was it easy for you to sniff out or see the leadership qualities in the people you managed? Did you have to learn how to look intentionally for it?
I think a little bit of the latter. In some cases, you can see how somebody responds to getting something done where you have delegated not just some personnel management responsibility, but also some of the thought and the leeway and how it gets done. You say, hey, okay, I know there's differences. So this site, this one's left to right, this one's right to left. You got to make it work. I'm giving you designers, but you make it work. And then see what they do with something like that. Because sometimes you find people, I mean, just like I was just an engineer at first, and somebody just went, okay, well, he doesn't mind getting stuff done, and he doesn't mind not always having his hands on the keyboard. And you have to be able to sniff that out too, and just see when somebody's like, oh, this person doesn't mind running with it and can actually get it done and can actually realize that he's responsible for the whole thing. Because some people, they want a ticket. Can you spell it all out in a ticket? Okay, so you want me to give you every last thing you should do that you could execute? Yes, okay, good. And then you write it all down. That one's not a leader. That one doesn't want to be a leader right now. That one would rather do the ticket. And that's fine. You need those guys too, because otherwise tickets don't get done. But at the same time, yeah, there is a little bit of that sniffing that you have to do of like, good, who is willing to kind of rise up and take a little bit more responsibility.
And then as far as the interviewing skills, had you done interviews of like potential peers, or did you just not really have any experience interviewing people until you took on the role?
So I didn't really have experience interviewing people until I took on the role. I was, for the most part, an individual contributor up until then. Sometimes you're only like a person leaving away from all of a sudden realizing that you're in a leadership role. You know what I mean? Because sometimes, you're like, oh, I just work here. I just do this thing. And then the person who is really holding everything together leaves for another area or leaves the company or whatever. And then suddenly you're holding it all together. And next thing you know, a manager comes in and says, who's holding this all together in here? And you're like, I guess it's me. And you're it. Sometimes it's not, hey, you've been promoted. Sometimes it's a bit more by default, you've inherited these responsibilities.
How did you do that self-analysis and determine whether you wanted to continue with people management or not? Because it's one thing to choose it. It's another to, okay, this is the ball's in your court. We need you to do this.
So one thing that I struggled with a bit when I was managing is I knew that there was going to be a point in managing where I simply could not keep up enough with tech. Because when I first started managing, I knew that if anybody flamed out, that I could roll up my sleeves and do their thing. This was in a little bit of the earlier days, but I could still develop, and I could still, all the system stuff I could do, and I could still do the design work, curiously enough. And so I knew that if anybody flamed out, I could actually do that. And then the longer I managed, the more I was like, so such and such new tool came out, and I've never touched it, and I don't know how it works. And that's where you start to go, okay, good. So what do I do now? Do I start using all my extra time to go and bone up on this stuff that I need to understand? Do I personally start making concessions and just say, well, maybe I just don't need to know these things and I can just be one of these kind of higher level bosses who doesn't really know technology anymore? Do I start doing individual contributor work for X amount of time every day? Like this. So there's some of these things where I really kind of had to, what is the right way to juggle? Obviously, an effective technical manager knows about the technology that they're implementing. To a degree, you're not going to necessarily be effective to a degree, right? So obviously there are lines to that. I mean, these days, there's no such thing. I mean, we're 2 decades away from where anybody used the term webmaster, right? So, I mean, these days, I already know if I have a team that's working on something, like I got a project right now, I've got some people who are like hardcore Java developers. I'm not a hardcore Java developer. So I already know I can run that person, but I don't know all the things that they're doing. So I need another Java lead who can do a lot of their code reviews and stuff like that, things like that. So I've found my footing these days, whereas at that point in time, I hadn't. To answer your question, I don't really know how to answer the question all the way of what is the right time and when. So for me, the time that I really switched was having a baby. And I went, you know what? I actually want hours. I want to stop. I want to work during this time and stop at this time. And I want the rest of that time, I've got a baby strapped to my chest and I'm going for a hike. And that was a very conscious decision. I'm like, and so there were people who were asking me if I wanted a leadership role. And I was saying, I do not at this time. Not because I doubt my fitness to cope or something like that. It was a conscious decision about where do I want to be? And I guess that kind of comes back to, so there's this term work-life balance. And I feel like that gets misused sometimes, that term, inferring that you have to have equal parts of something, which is not true. I don't even think there is such a thing because you're going to put yourself out of whack if you really try to be actually balanced. But it does mean that parts of your life kind of really need to be talking to each other. I do need this much time to be dad, and I'm totally going to do that. And if I'm not doing that, then it is out of whack. And so that's where you make conscious decisions about your career to say, good, can I follow this crazy, ambitious career at this stage of my life? And I made the decision at that point in time. I know there's plenty of other people with small children that also pursue ridiculously ambitious, tech leadership careers. But there's a different composition of elements for everybody. For me, that was the decision I made at that time.
So for anybody listening, they should think about where they are in their life, how much time they're willing to commit, because it's not just 9 to 5 when you're the boss.
No, it's not. But that's the other thing too. My youngest is 9 now. I got 3, and they're all in activities. But my wife and I have a juggling act where we're able to get stuff done, whereas I'm now also able to work at much more intense hours. And so a couple of years back, I made the decision. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go hard in on being a consultant. I'm gonna see if I can build up this company, and we're gonna do some cool stuff. And my wife gave me air cover to be able to do that. She's like, good. Well, let's get this done. We also then set aside time. Weekends are pretty much off limits. We do our renos. We do kid activities. We're mountain biking. We're replacing the windows in our house. I learned how to be a carpenter. My wife is teaching me. She's a woodworker. So we got all these tools in the garage. People are always coming over laying, hey, man, you got nice tools. I'm like, man, those are my wife's. I talk to her. I just work here.
Oh, that's awesome. I love the protecting your time. That's really cool. Well, listen, Tad, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us and share your story with our listeners. If anybody wants to follow up with you on this conversation, ask more questions, where can they find you?
A couple places. So I work for Arbery Digital, and blog.arbordigital.com is my blog. It's also my podcast where I talk about Adobe Experience Manager, and it's a lot of fun.
And are there any technical communities or specific conferences that you recommend people get involved in if they want to work with that type of technology or in that area of expertise?
Absolutely. And I would say so I mentioned it once in the talk, but Adobe Summit is the one particularly for my area. I'm there every year. It's a great place to meet people and get technically up to speed. I find that conferences like that, the big show for your Dreamforces and all that sort of stuff for any one of those, sometimes they can get really salesy, but they're also they're where you meet the people that are going to take your career to the next level. One other piece of advice that I forgot to give along the way is that going to those conferences and not just being a spectator, sitting right up front, and then right afterwards go ask the presenter a bunch of stuff, and next thing you know all the people at the company, all the lead engineers, and you can get some really amazing stuff done. So the sit in the back and be a wallflower thing, that was for grade school. Right now, it's a good idea to sit in the front.
One of the things we've heard Tad highlight again and again throughout this discussion is that he likes to build things that people can use and enjoy. And I think getting that positive feedback on his blog articles that he had been writing from other people at Adobe Summit was that next iteration of getting the fulfillment and the realization that he was reaching way more people than he thought. And Tad had originally started writing these blogs for himself so that he could reference it later. And when he realized that he could help other people, he kept writing, he kept blogging, and he was building his expertise in that area of Adobe Experience Manager and content management and everything that goes around that ecosystem. I think this is a great example of what Andrew Miller was talking about in episode 165 about being intentional with your personal brand. Great episode to go back and listen to. You heard undertones of it again in this episode, and of course in episode 297, specific times in our lives may be better suited for a certain type of job. Tad talked about stepping out of consulting in episode 297 because they were going to have another baby. And then in this episode, Tad talked about reasons to step away from management because of a family situation. So you need to remember that as much as it depends on you, right? I get that the job market is a little bit tough at the time of this recording, but if it's your decision, the type of job and the expectations of that job may or may not be suited for where you are in your life right now. If you want to hear more stories about people having some career zigzags, let's just say, go back and listen to episodes 201 and 202 with Yvette Edwards and her stories of boomeranging up to management, back to individual contributor, and then back to management again. It's not always a straight line. We don't have to do the same type of job forever. Please, please, please remember that. And then also, if we get in the Wayback Machine, go back to episode 68, when life disrupts your work-life balance, because that is a pretty good one as well. For all you managers out there, I can certainly understand how juggling this idea of how technically deep am I going to be in this knowledge area that my team covers. That has to be a challenge. I feel like that's been something that's been challenging for most every person we've spoken to who's gone into people management at some level. We also spoke about technical conferences. Tad mentioned Adobe Summit. He mentioned Dreamforce. There are many others out there that we could attend, but he is absolutely on point that if you go to a technical conference, whether it's a 4 or 5 day conference in a different city, or whether it's, a single mini 1-day conference, or even a community group meeting that's a couple hours one evening, be the person that goes up and talks to other people, ask them about what they do, tell them what you're interested in, and you never know who you might meet, because the technology world is a lot smaller than we think. And I'll also say, if you can't go to one of those big conferences, a lot of large technology vendors have some online only type conferences that you can attend. They may be free, they may be paid. It's a great way to build some additional skills. It may not be as good for networking with other people as the in-person event is. But if you do one of those conferences that's 100% online, maybe it's a good idea to take the day off or take part of the day off to be able to do that and 100% focus on being present and learning as much as you can. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Tad. If you did, please rate us 5 stars and consider writing a review. I'd love to hear what made you want to press play on this series and kept you listening to the end. We'll see you next week.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.